004117, Central Arabian Sea. The torpedo was already in the water. Range, 4,200 meters. Speed, 48 knots. Impact window, 127 seconds. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a single officer stood motionless. His hand hovered over a console that had never been touched in combat. Around him, automated systems were transitioning states without human input. Threat probability crossed 87%. Countermeasure protocols activated. Weapon doors unlocked. No alarms sounded. The silence meant the decision had already been made. Somewhere beneath the carrier, an Iranian Kilo-class submarine was completing a firing sequence it had practiced for years. The Americans weren't supposed to detect it this early. The weapon wasn't supposed to be trackable this soon. Both assumptions were wrong. At 004129, the officer received the confirmation he was waiting for. It didn't arrive. Instead, a second countdown began inside the first. Automated defense systems shifted into a mode that did not require orders. They were still under control, but no longer waiting. Sonar arrays locked. Surface combatants adjusted course by fractions. A helicopter banked hard without radio instruction. The carrier wasn't reacting. It was already arranged. The submarine wasn't stalking prey. It had entered a managed kill corridor, one that had been forming for 11 minutes. The Iranian commander believed he had surprise. Surprise was gone, but the torpedo was still closing. At 004147, the officer made the call that would define the next 32 minutes. He didn't order an attack. He authorized removal of constraints. That distinction would matter later. Subscribe. Moments like this don't announce themselves. Was this restraint or the beginning of something worse? If the clock has you locked in, stay with it. What follows happened before anyone thought this had started. The carrier strike group had been tracking the submarine for 17 minutes. Not aggressively, not visibly, just watching. The Iranians assumed they were invisible beneath the thermal layer. They assumed the Americans were distracted by flight operations overhead. They assumed wrong. By the time the torpedo entered the water, 3 destroyers had already repositioned. Anti-submarine helicopters were airborne, not scrambled, already flying. The submarine wasn't in a firing position. It was in a trap. But no one had told the Iranian commander. And no one had told him to stop. 000934. 17 minutes earlier. The sea state was calm enough to mistake for permission. Radar scopes painted slow arcs. Flight operations continued on schedule. Catapult crews worked by muscle memory. Deck handlers gave signals older than sonar. Inside the carrier's sonar shack, a junior technician flagged a classification change. Not urgent, not unusual, just notable. Submerged contact, bearing 317 degrees, depth below thermal layer, speed 6 knots. The chief sonar operator leaned closer. He didn't call it out yet. Classifications changed constantly. Fishing vessels drifted. Civilian traffic wandered. Small returns blinked along the Iranian coast like static. But this one didn't fade. At 001102, the contact adjusted course. Not away, not directly toward. Parallel. That detail triggered the first raised eyebrow. Parallel movement meant shadowing or positioning. The chief made a notation in the log. No alarm. No escalation. Just awareness. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a watch officer received a data packet from the carrier at 001218. It wasn't marked urgent. A single line appeared on a secure terminal. Unidentified submerged contact, maneuvering towards CSG at sustained speed. No mention of intent. No mention of threat. That omission mattered. The packet was mirrored to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, then relayed to naval operations at the Pentagon. Not escalated. Logged. Above deck, pilots checked straps. Coffee was replaced. Chairs squeaked. Nothing suggested a clock had started. Inside the Iranian submarine, the commander reviewed his orders one final time. Approach to weapons range. Establish firing solution. Await authorization. Do not engage without confirmation. He had been told the Americans would never detect him this early. He had been told they were predictable, focused on air threats, not subsurface. Both briefings were obsolete. At 001447, the submarine crossed a threshold the Iranians didn't know existed. A geographic trigger line. Invisible. Predetermined. Weeks old. The moment the submarine entered that zone, automated alerts cascaded through the carrier strike group. Not to humans, to systems. Destroyers widened spacing by 2 degrees. A helicopter adjusted altitude without pilot input. Sonar arrays shifted from passive to active listening postures. No orders were given. The network had already decided. At 001620, the Iranian commander requested updated intelligence from Tehran. The reply took 19 seconds longer than expected. He didn't notice. 002401. The submarine reduced speed, 2 knots. Nothing dramatic. But that single change triggered a cascade. Automated classification algorithms updated. Threat probability ticked upward, not because the submarine was closing, but because it wasn't. In modern naval doctrine, hesitation near a carrier strike group was itself a form of escalation. Slowing meant positioning. Positioning meant intent. At 002439, the carrier's commanding officer was briefed in person. No screens, no slides, just a voice, low and controlled. Contact is within estimated launch envelope if hostile. The captain didn't ask how likely hostility was. He asked one question instead. How long until they could fire and we couldn't stop it? The answer came without hesitation. Less than 3 minutes. That answer moved the situation into a different category. Not officially. Not on paper. Psychologically. At 002512, the captain authorized a change from deterrent posture to defensive readiness condition 3. No alarms sounded, but automated systems noticed. Anti-submarine warfare helicopters tightened their search pattern. The USS gravely received green light authority for preparatory countermeasure deployment. No weapons released. Just preparation. In the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, a watch officer flagged the situation for review. Not for action, for awareness. The word torpedo had not been used, yet. At 002745, sonar data suggested the submarine had crossed a depth threshold consistent with weapons readiness. No weapon doors opened. No acoustic spike confirmed it. But the silence changed. Or silence could mean discipline, or it could mean a hand hovering over a trigger. At 002908, the Iranian commander received delayed guidance from higher command. Not an order. A question. Confirm American posture unchanged. He reviewed his passive sonar data. Surface combatants maintained routine spacing. Flight operations continued. No aggressive maneuvering detected. He reported back, no indication of awareness. That assessment was 11 minutes out of date. At 003120, the submarine's weapons officer reported torpedo readiness. The tubes were flooded. The firing solution was locked. Authorization was still pending. At 003314, Iranian command sent final approval. The transmission took 41 seconds to reach the submarine. In that gap, the American carrier strike group made a decision no one would report publicly. They authorized removal of constraints. At 003402, the submarine fired. 004117. The torpedo was in the water, 127 seconds to impact. Countermeasures deployed automatically, noisemakers, decoys. The carrier began a turn it had pre-calculated 9 minutes earlier. The torpedo adjusted course. It was tracking. At 004124, defensive systems achieved lock. The weapon could be intercepted. Probability, 94%. But interception wasn't the response. At 004131, something else happened. Something that had been set in motion 17 minutes earlier, before the torpedo, before the firing solution, before anyone thought this was the crisis. An American P-8 Poseidon aircraft, launched hours ago on unrelated patrol, crossed a geographic trigger line drawn weeks earlier. That line had nothing to do with the submarine. It had everything to do with what came next. A signal left the aircraft. Another left Bahrain. A third left Washington. None referenced the carrier by name. They referenced regional escalation control. Within 90 seconds, cyber systems began isolating Iranian naval command networks, not disabling, delaying. Orders sent from Tehran slowed. Responses vanished into queue delays measured in seconds. But seconds mattered now. The submarine waited for confirmation that would never arrive. At 004208, the torpedo lost lock. Not because of countermeasures. Because its guidance data stream had been severed. The weapon continued forward on inertial tracking, but inertial tracking against a moving carrier was a coin flip. At 004253, the torpedo passed 800 meters astern. No impact, no explosion, no headlines. Inside the Combat Direction Center, no one spoke. The Iranian commander requested immediate status update from higher command. The reply didn't come. He requested again. Silence. At 004317, he made the decision that would define his career. He ordered emergency ascent, not to attack, to survive. Subscribe. If this happens again, you'll want to recognize it. Was this deterrence or escalation disguised as restraint? At 004402, the submarine broke the thermal layer. It was no longer invisible. American helicopters adjusted course, not threatening, not retreating, just closer. At 004451, the submarine surfaced enough to establish communication. By then, Iranian Naval Command had regained partial network access. The first message they sent was not tactical. It was political. Withdraw immediately. The submarine complied. At 004509, the crisis ended. No second torpedo was fired. No counterstrike authorized. No war declared. But everything had changed. Public silence followed. No press briefings. No diplomatic protests. No leaked cables. Both sides filed internal summaries that would never be declassified. The American version logged the incident as non-kinetic deterrent success. The Iranian version described it as tactical probe. Mission parameters achieved. Both claimed victory. Neither mentioned proximity to war. Inside the Pentagon, analysts reviewed the timeline with surgical precision. Total time from first contact detection to torpedo launch: 31 minutes, 28 seconds. Total time inside hostile weapons envelope: 11 minutes, 14 seconds. Total human decisions required to prevent escalation: 3. Total weapons released by U.S. forces: 0. But beneath those numbers, a different assessment circulated among senior officers. A single-line summary that never appeared in official reports. Event demonstrated loss of escalation control before first shot. No celebration followed, because the systems had already learned how to do it faster next time. In classified briefings conducted weeks later, doctrine was quietly updated. Authorization thresholds were lowered. Automation boundaries were expanded. Human decision time was reduced. The next crisis would require fewer people and less time. The submarine commander was reassigned, not punished, removed. His replacement received new standing orders that eliminated the need for confirmation in certain scenarios. The carrier strike group adjusted its defensive posture. Helicopters now launched earlier. Cyber response protocols activated sooner. the invisible lines moved closer. Both sides prepared for a crisis that would unfold faster than this one. Both sides believed they had learned the right lesson. Neither mentioned what had actually happened. The torpedo had missed, but escalation control had been lost 11 minutes before it was fired. The next time, there might not be 11 minutes. Final assessment, never shown publicly. Time elapsed, 32 minutes, 11 seconds. Decisions that mattered, 1. Weapons that changed the outcome, 0. Systems that learned, all of them. Escalation control was lost before the first shot was possible. Silence.